the failure to obey is going to cost us dearly. A lot of times it's going to cost us the very thing we desire the most. I don't want to do this because I think I know better. I want this to happen. Well, many times we disobey. God's not going to bless you. God won't allow that to happen. And a lot of times maybe we run away thinking we're going to find something. We get there, guess what? It is not what you wanted. God blesses when we obey. God knows what is best in our life. Our failure to obey is very, very costly. I bet a lot of us could say amen to that. Okay. Next one. Right counsel will always encourage obedience. Right counsel will always encourage obedience. Now, we don't know in verse 13 if the servant was saved or not. And I'll say this, sometimes lost people can tell us the right thing. But, understand this, right counsel will always encourage obedience to God. This guy had a brilliant statement there in verse 13. My father, if the prophet had bid you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much rather than when he says to you, wash and be clean? He just simply said this, why don't you just do what he tells you to do? Good counsel will always encourage you to be obedient. Don't look for somebody that tells you to disobey God. And if somebody's telling you to disobey God, it's bad counsel. It's bad counsel. Proverbs 12:15. Go just a couple pages forward. Just on some good verses on counsel. The fool is right in his own eyes. There's that pride again. I know what's best. I'm not going to do what the Bible tells me. I know what's better. The fool is right in his own eyes, but he that hearkens unto counsel is wise. Proverbs 13:10, just some verses here. Only by pride comes contention, but with the well-advised is wisdom. Proverbs 15:22 says this. It says, without counsel, purposes are disappointed. How many times we want what's right and somebody will try to tell us what to do and giving us good, wise counsel? Do what the Bible tells you to do. Do what God's telling you. Be faithful to God. We turn away from that, and guess what happens? Our purposes are disappointed. Things don't work out like we planned. But in a multitude of counselors, they are established. Always listen to good counsel. Right counsel, godly counsel will always encourage obedience to God. That's how you can determine whether it's good or bad to do. If somebody comes to you and says, this is what the Bible says, I think you should do it, that's good counsel. One last thing here. Obedience and being obedient is always encouraging. It will help your own faith and it will help others. It is always encouraging. Look at verse number 15 and 16. It says, he did what God told him to do. He did the difficult thing. He went, he dunked in that filthy river, and he came up, he's clean. He's changed. And verse 15 says this, he returned to the man of God, he and all his company, and he came and stood before him. You know what? He's coming back now, and he's not prideful anymore. He comes back. He wants to be a blessing to the man of God. He wants to give him some things, as we'll see in verse 17. But look what he says. Behold, now I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel. Now therefore I pray you, take a blessing of your servant. You know, when he goes, he said, I was blessed, I was changed, and he was encouraged by that. In fact, he realizes something. Man, this is where God is. This guy is speaking for God. Verse 16 says, "But he said, as the Lord lives before whom I stand," this is Elisha saying, "as the Lord lives before whom I stand, I will receive none." And he urged him to take it, but he refused. You know, Naaman was completely changed. In fact, he was so changed, man, he wanted to give and give and give. Now, this is not a message on giving, but notice the change in this man. All of a sudden, he's upset, he's angry, he's wrathful, he's full of pride, he's full of unbelief. And this guy's completely changed. And don't you think that that change, because he was obedient, didn't have an effect on all of his company in verse 15? When we do what God tells us to do, our own faith will be changed and the faith of others will be changed. The fact is, are you going to do what God tells you to do? I'll go back to what Henrietta Veer said. When God gives them command or truth, it's never a question of what He will do, but what we will do. You might be struggling with who knows what today. I don't know what your problems are. I don't know what your struggles are, and I don't know, maybe know some of what's going on in your life, but probably every one of us came in here with some sort of struggle with something. It's part of the, as we would say, the human condition. The question isn't, well, what's God going to do? The question, God will always bless. God is always going to change us. God is always going to make us better. The question is, do I want to do what God tells me to do? Naaman could have gone back to Syria, jumped in his clean river 7 times, and he'd still be a leper. He could have dumped in there 17 times, 70 times, 1,000, he would still been a leper. Because God's ways are right. The question isn't what God will do. The question is, what will you do? Maybe you've come in here and you know what God has been telling you to do through whatever situation you might find yourself. You know some of the things that what you're supposed to be doing in different ways. Many of you, I don't see any too many visitors hit the ice. And they said this, that many of the people in third class were just immigrants coming from places like Italy and France. They were coming to America to start their lives anew. And they were just down in third class. They had paid their way, they got on the trip, and they were coming. And stewards were running down to third class, and they were saying this, you need to get to the top. We're here to take you to the top. To get on the lifeboats. Get on the boats. Lifeboats to save yourself. You know what? A lot of these people in third class, as the stewards were kind of trying to wake them up and get them out, they said, I don't understand what you're saying. They were Italian. They spoke Italy. They spoke Italian. They spoke French. They spoke German. They spoke Spanish. They didn't have a clue what these people were trying to tell them. We go and guess what we need to do, folks? We need to learn how to share our faith. Because a lot of the times, guess what we do? People don't have a clue what the gospel is anymore. Many in third class perished. Why? Because they didn't know what was being said. Many in third class thought they understood what was being said, and they ran to the wrong side of the boat. Guess what happens today with a lot of people? There's so many people with all sorts of things telling people so many different ways to heaven. Guess what they're doing? They're running to the wrong side of the boat. We've got the truth. Then they said many of the wives and children in third class, well, their husbands ran to the top to see what was wrong, and they wouldn't leave. Why? Because they didn't want to leave without their family. They wanted their husband there first. You know why sometimes people don't get saved? Yeah, their families hold them back. But it doesn't change the fact that we're to do what? Warn them of a danger that's ahead. There'll be one last group. And I read this. I could not believe it. There were those that had worked in the ship. They got their first jobs and they were excited about it, and they were insisting that the ship was not that damaged. And especially of that were the bakers. A big ship. Many people on it. And that evening, the bakers went in early to bake bread for the next day. And they say that many of the stewards went and they found the bakers doing what? Baking bread. Mixing bread. Having things rise. They said, you get out of here. The ship hit an iceberg. The ship is sinking. And you know what they said? Well, we've got bread in the oven and we need to prepare the bread for tomorrow. And they stayed in the bakery and died in the bakery, thinking that everything's going to be okay. Sad, tragic thing. They all perished. Because you know what? When they finally realized that something was happening, it was too late. Too busy. I've got my job. Too busy. A failure to heed the call to escape. In Acts chapter 24, and I'll close with this verse, and we'll finish here. Paul preaching to a man who was a leader. He was, in a sense, a judge. His name was Felix. And it said this, that Paul was preaching to him. It says, and he reasoned with him in verse 25, of righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come. That's basically the gospel. God's righteousness, our need to respond to that, be temperate in our life, because there's a judgment to come. It says this, Felix trembled, and he answered, go your way for this time, and when I have a convenient season, I'll call for you. Paul, go ahead. When I have time, I'll call for you. Problem is, time never came. And in our lives, we need to understand something. It's appointed unto men once to die, and after death comes a judgment. The awfulness of it is, the Bible says, what's our life but a vapor? Here's for a little while, vanishes away. A titanic failure. How about you? Are you presuming upon the future? You were to die today. Something would happen this afternoon. Are you ready to meet God? Don't presume upon the future. Accept Christ while you have an opportunity. As Christians, I think many times we need to think we have all the time in the world to tell our friends and our neighbors about the gospel. Man, today, do it as today. Are you neglecting the warnings? Are you neglecting your duty as a believer? Selfish with the gospel. Man, the call comes out. I hope you respond. Shall we stand with our heads bowed, our eyes closed? Nobody looking away.